It's December 1st, 1990, and this is Peter Schaaphok talking with Hilda Allen. And I'll start with this question. I guess if you could just start with your family background, who your parents were.
Well, my parents were John H. Moon and Lena Babcock, and they were both born in Petersburg, and their parents were, three of their parents were born in Petersburg. My grandmother Moon was a Snyder from Grafton, so pretty much Petersburg stock. The Babcock name comes from Thomas Babcock, who first settled around 1800 in North Petersburg, in the corner of Hoosick, where the town joins Hoosick and Grafton, and he raised a large family of children up there. The Moons started on up very near the top where the Taconic Pass. I think that's where the road goes over the mountain to Williamstown. They started out there and then moved on down into the valley near the head of the Dayfoot. So that's those two families. The Snyders were, and they're the same Snyders who now live in Petersburg. That's the same Snyder family. Keith and Barbara.
Okay.
So the same Snyder family. They were early settlers of Grafton, and they had earlier than that they had been in Pittstown, and they were Dutch and German extraction.
All right, so they weren't.
But they were all here by shortly after 1700. So they were the earlier one of the earlier waves, not the ones that came in the 1830s or 40s. The Goodamotes and Jordans came then in the 1830s and 40s.
Right.
So they were a different group, a later group. Don't know if there's anything else that's particular to tell you about my family, except they've just been here ever since.
How about the Allen family?
The Allen family. Well, the Allen family, and as a matter of fact, all these families, both my, except for the Snyders, who came from the west and the Hudson, up the Hudson River Valley. The Allens, as well as the Moons and the Babcocks, all came from Rhode Island, the area around Westerly and Stonington. And the Allens came from Rhode Island, but they had earlier lived in Rehoboth, which is just across in Massachusetts, right, in that disputed territory, and Barrington, Massachusetts. That's where the Allens came from. And they also came around in the 1780s, like the others, and mostly settled on the Grafton side.
Okay. Now, who was it who came over the mountain and thought they were going to see all?
Oh, that's with the Armsby family. That was
that's the Armsbys.
Yeah,
okay.
Those were the Armsbys or Armsburys. Those were two brothers, and they were my father's great grandparents. He had great grandparents who were Armsbys. John and Thomas Armsby both came, and John spelled his name B-Y, A-R-M-S-B-Y, and Thomas spelled his B-U-R-Y.
So that's why.
So yes,
okay.
And the last of the name to live in Petersburg were three unmarried people who were, let's see, two sisters and a brother, and they were the product. They had other siblings, but those three never married. They lived where Carl Webster lives.
Okay.
And their parents were first cousins, both Armsby. So one was an Armsby and one was an Armsbury.
How about the Armsburys or Armsbys who lived up on?
That was John's family.
Where Harold.
That was John's
okay.
family.
Because that's what's interesting with that farm.
Yeah.
It's only been owned by the Armsburys or the Brocks. It's all history.
Yes, that's the one that John Armsby finally found after he'd come to the top of the hill and then landed at the Moon Farm. I've told that story to you before, I guess.
Well, tell it again.
Well, Dake Moon had the property at the top of the trail, and his cabin. I suppose it was a small, just a little log cabin, probably. Maybe it wasn't log. I don't know whether they built slabs, probably. And the story was that the Armsbys came up the side of the mountain and came to this little place and thought when they got to the top of that mountain they could look down and see Albany. And they had been led to believe that it was all cleared land, and they expected to look like in England, look down and see just lovely, lovely fields, all green, and And of course, what they saw was a sea of trees and this one little bitty cabin in the woods. So they stopped there and stayed there until, I guess, until they felt they were able to go on, or at least the father did. And then they went on and eventually found their place on top of
On Potter Hill.
Potter Hill.
Okay, all
Mhm,
right.
mhm.
So that was say their property. It was opposite Harold's place, and then I guess they later got the property across where Harold's farm is now,
I
or
guess.
Forrest's place,
Yes, I think so. I think they spread in that direction.
Because on the
Mhm.
original, well, on the map we had out before, it shows Armsbury on the other side of the road, but that's, okay.
And it's kind of, it interests me. Now, Maud Welsh, who was in Armsby, told that story. And she was born about 1870. And she heard it from her grandmother, and who had got it, I think, probably from Priscilla Armsby, who was the wife who came, because she lived to be almost 100 and would have been alive when Maud's grandmother would have heard stories told.
So it's really been passed on pretty directly then.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's undoubtedly truth to it. Of course, the Date Moon's son married John Armsby's daughter. Later, so
Okay.
those were my father's great grandparents.
All right.
So that's what I particularly know about them.
Okay, I guess going on, well, a little bit about what it was like growing up in Petersburg when you grew up
Well,
there.
you know, as I think back about it, I walked a lot. Everybody, I seem to remember myself as constantly walking. We all had, our families all had automobiles, but whenever we went any place, we walked.
This is in the 1920s and 30s.
Oh yes. I was born in 1918, so you see, I was in the 1920s. I was a child, really, and in the 1930s I went to high school.
He was a
and so
teenager.
on. Yeah, right. But as a child, I'm very conscious of walking, and I was trying. I've written down some where I had a territory, sort of, where I was very familiar with people, and it began really with the three Reynoldses down by not the double road crossing, but where Charles Bentley has built his house.
Right.
And the Victorian house there that's been recently renovated that Charles Bentley did own.
Right.
Yeah, that was a Reynolds house. And when I remember it, there were the three Reynoldses lived there. And that were two sisters and a brother. And one of the sisters was chubby and drove the car, and she drove the car. And her slender sister rode with her, Miss Mary and Miss Lizzie. And they were very, very proper ladies and nice. And they had a brother, Sidney. Sid was, well, he was more interesting, really, than his sisters, because he was a little strange. And he had strange ideas and did kind of odd things. I can remember, and he drove horse, and he didn't bother with a car. He drove a horse and carriage. And I can remember he drove by our house on his way to the village very frequently. And I remember once I was outside, and he looked toward our house and he said, "John Moon, sun, moon, and stars." Well, that was the kind of thing. And on the rocks down by his house, he wrote Rock Island Pacific, and it may well still say Rock Island Pacific. The river has rocks.
Yes.
Well, he was an interesting person.
Boy.
And he built a whole bunches of little buildings all around the house.
Now, was he ever married, or?
No.
And how old was he when he was?
Well, let me see. Well, they all died, I think, in the late 30s or thereabouts.
So he was already older then.
Oh yes, they were elderly. They were elderly people, and that's another thing that but a lot of elderly unmarried people there were in the 30s. There were three, all in one
Right.
family.
Then you mentioned before the.
And just the next place up were the three
Right.
Armsbys. None of them was married. They all lived together in the family farm.
Oh boy.
And the next, well, then there were the three houses that I don't remember much about. And I don't remember much about. I don't know who lives there now. They're small houses on the left as you travel south.
On what's now Armsby
kind of
Road.
some newer, smaller houses. By
Right.
newer, I mean
Yeah.
1800 or 1900-ish,
Right, right.
maybe a little bit more. But then, of course, there was then Tom Barber's. Only when I first remembered it was Tom Barber, but earlier than that, that had been an I believe an Armsby's had lived there. But because I've heard my father tell about going to parties at Artie Armsby's there. Yes, but I'm not too sure about it. But anyway, it's the funeral home now.
Right. When did that start as a funeral home?
Tom Barber was the first one to have the funeral home there, and that was well after 1926, but I think before 1930.
Okay.
Because my brother died in 1926, and Frank Reynolds was the undertaker. And by the time my grandfather died in 1931, Tom Barber was. So I'm sure it was in that time period that they changed.
Okay. And so
Tom had helped Frank Reynolds.
Now, who is it? Is it his son now, who or a family?
No, it just keeps the name. Tom had no children. And he took into his business Bob Higgins from Steventown, and they worked together. They were in business together, but they kept their own names. Hall and Higgins in Steventown, and Thomas and Barber in Petersburg.
Oh,
And now Stegeman has those, but he still keeps the original names, I think.
Oh, it's another person who owns it.
Oh yeah,
I didn't
yeah,
know that.
yeah.
So-
There were two generations of Tom Barber, then 2 generations of Higginses, and then Higgins sold the business to Stegeman.
All right.
So it's been quite a long time since Tom Barber. Oh, he died as not a very old man. Johnny Little was a doctor here. That would have been in the around 1950, early 50s. Of course, could look it up in the cemetery records. But I think it was somewhere around 1950 that Tom died.
Now, which school did you go to?
Oh, I went to village school. Cause,
so it was almost across the street for you.
well, no, my family didn't live there. My mother loved to move. My father didn't especially, but he was handy at fixing houses, so my mother saw to it that we moved. No, first, when I was born, my grandfather, Moon, had built a house for them after they were married in 1914. He built a house above his own farmhouse, where Oscar and Liddy, when my grandfather sold it to Oscar Lemire, it's in Hill Hollow. Bill Swackhammer, do you know where I mean?
No,
Bill Swackhammer?
no.
Well, let's see. Let's go up, up Hill Hollow.
Right.
Earl Hewitt, you know where he lives. Mm-hmm. Then there's you don't go over the road to what used to be Jess Maxon's, but you don't do that. You keep on going up the hill, and then there's a newish house on the left next to the little cemetery. And then there's a farmhouse on the right, Victorian house. That was built about 1880. My grandfather's brother, Landon, built that house.
Okay.
I've got a
This is
picture
before
of
you get to Sterry Hewitt's.
this is, well, yeah,
Okay.
more than a mile before you
Okay.
get to Sterry Hewitt's. It's just the house right at the top. And when you look from that house, that's the view you see. We're used to.
Yes.
That's up above Donald Hewitt's, that open field.
And that's looking right out towards where we are, so towards Potter Hill.
Yeah, right.
So
So there's a nice view from that place. Well, anyway, my grandfather at that time, he had bought 3 different farms. The farm he was on had been a Waite, and Waits and Mains had lived there, and that's where he built his house. And then he had the one above it, the farm above it. It was called the Tilly Place, and that's where he built the house for my father and mother. And Jackie Baguki lived there.
all right, I know.
You
that.
know.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes.
And there was an old house there, but that was the Tilly house. But my mother wanted to live in that house, but my father and grandfather said that was ridiculous. It was too old. It was about to fall down. And it didn't fall down while we lived there. I remember playing there. And then there was what they call the old place was to the northwest. You go down a hill and up again, and that was the old place. And that abutted the Armsby places. That's where the great-grandfather lived. You see, it was had the Armsby mother.
Now, is that gone, or is that still?
That's long gone, I'm sure, and I have never been there. But that's where Rufus Moon, my great-grandfather, is said to have had an example of every kind of apple tree that would grow in this climate.
Oh boy!
And peacocks. And as I have written in when I talk about the Eagle Opera House, he wasn't very practical. He liked peacocks and opera houses better than he liked tending to business.
Now, when was he laid? He was in 18.
He was born in 1814 and died in 1893.
All right, so, and he was the one who lived over in that place that's gone, and
Yeah,
that's
right.
within every kind of,
Mhm.
that's,
But my father said the last time he was over there, quite a number of the trees, the apple trees were still very.
because I just
kind
ran
of
up, as a matter of fact, Lloyd Hewitt loaned me a photograph, and I think it's taken from around there, because it looks down over sort of Armsby's Flats there, and then up on towards Potter Hill, and I think, and I was saying, where is that? I've got to find,
Yeah.
get in there.
Well,
And so-
I suppose I could probably do it. I've always wanted to go over there. My father and I were always going to do it. He was always going to take me, but we never did. He was always going to show me where the old house was, but I never saw it. Now, let's
Okay.
see, I've kind of got off the beaten track. I've forgotten what you asked.
Well, we
in
were
the
just, I was
first
just,
place.
growing up in.
Oh, yes.
So you were
Oh,
telling
yes.
which houses
no,
you lived
yeah,
in.
That's
That's,
right. So, Mama didn't like farm life very well. She had lived in the village, and to her, every calf was a cow and every cow was a bull. So every time she saw a calf, she'd run for the house. And of course, I'm afraid my grandmother Moon might have sniffed a little bit, thought she was pretty silly. But anyway, Mama didn't like it very well up there. And every time she wanted to go to the village to see her family or to see anybody, she had to go down this long hill and push the baby carriage down the long hill and push it back up again. So after she had me and then my brother, she grew very unhappy here. So my father moved off the farm. My father didn't like farming very well. He never had charge of the farming. My grandfather was a very kind of stern, unbending character, and he was the boss. And my father was kind of more like his grandfather. He loved to make things and fix things and he.
Tinker.
Yes, he was. He was a natural tinker. He could fix just about anything and make just about anything that he felt like. And then his father was impatient with that. And so, but of course, going along, almost everybody was a farmer in some degree. But they had other things they did. And my grandfather had been, and this was before they had superintendents of highways. They had road commissioners,
Right.
and and for a long time people did the piece of road near their house.
No, I've got the.
Well, when that system began to change, my grandfather, and this was in the early 1900s, and Henry's grandfather at that time was first sheriff and then a state senator and the Republican big shot of in that part of the county.
That's Victoria's father.
Victoria's father, right. And of course our folks were Republicans. So my grandfather was successively, for many years, he was superintendent of highways, or they called it road commissioner, single road commissioner. But he had the job, but my father did the work until almost 1920, and then my father was elected. Then they started electing superintendents, and my father was elected. So when I was little, my father was superintendent of highways and had a truck on the road, and they employed 30 men because of course they didn't have all the mechanized equipment, and that was interesting to me. But when we moved off the farm, my father had that for a job. And also, during the same time, my grandfather had been postmaster, and once again, my father did the work. He was assistant postmaster. He did the work in the post office. And my mother, who was considerably younger, when she got out of school, she got a job in the post office. And so my father and mother both worked in the post office in 1906. And Grandpa wasn't postmaster for very long. But this is all, of course, before they were married, and before the house was built and all that. But when we moved to the village, Pop was still superintendent of highways, and we moved into the house where Lou Scriven owns. The old name for it is the Salina Springer House. Nice old house.
Where was that?
Opposite Mabel Tripp on Head of the Lane Road.
Okay.
Next to the Methodist Church.
Right.
Just north of the Methodist Church. So we lived
Oh,
there.
we got a marvelous photograph of that.
That's
Yes.
a nice house.
We used to have a whole porch on it, which is gone now.
Oh,
but
well,
that was,
yeah, when I remember it with a porch, but of course it wasn't meant to have a porch in the beginning. It looks more like what did it first, I'm sure now. Anyway, while we lived there, my father bought the little old house across from it that had been an original Worthington house. That was very old house.
I've got a photograph of that house too. I should have brought those with me. That was stupid.
Yeah, well, that's gone now. Yeah. That was a very old house, and we lived there
Had,
while
had
that
a
was
well,
being
had a
fixed
well
up.
over on the right side. If you're standing in front of the house, facing out, it had a well on the left side in the back. It's a photograph that I have shows a.
It may have. It didn't when we lived there. Though we didn't. We had town water, and I don't remember any well.
Yep, that may.
But of course, my father may have. My mother probably said, "John, I will not have that water there. The children will fall in. You've got to do something about that." I don't remember that she said that, but that's what she would have said. And there must have been a well somewhere. In the neighborhood, there must have been one. I don't remember offhand where it was. We lived there most of the time when I was growing up. But then, of course, Depression came, and my mother got restless again. And then they bought the house with the stone wall down across from the store, across from City Store. With the Jerry Allen houses.
Right.
And while I was in college, and for some years after, then they lived there for a long time, until 1950, about 1950. Then they bought the Hartshorn house. Mama got restless again, and they bought the Hartshorn house. Each time my father, improved the house, and so that it was a lot better when he left than it was when he got it. And they lived in the Hartshorn house, 8 years or so. And then my father got sick, and for reasons which I never been able to understand, he sold that, and then rented the house, Maud Welch's house, and took the Maud, who was an Armsby cousin. He and my mother took care of Maud.
That's the house across the road.
It's gone now. The one that
the Don
house
Carpentier
that
took.
Carpentier took.
Oh, okay, that's
yeah, that's where they lived when my father died, and by it may have somehow figured in it. The reason Mama wanted to live in that house, I don't know. But when my brother was killed on the road, the school, was just nearby there.
Right.
He didn't stop the school as I was supposed to tell him to do, as I remembered I did. The train was coming, and he went on down the railroad bridge, and what the boys did was watch for the train from this way. And when the train went under the bridge, it was very exciting because the smoke came up. Of course, they were all old-style puffer engines,
right,
pre-diesel. And the smoke would come up through and the steam, and then you'd run to the other side of the bridge and watch the train go. Well, my brother didn't make it. A truck was coming down the
right.
hill.
You told me that.
Yeah.
But you weren't living in the Hartshorn house when that happened. I thought, I had that wrong.
No,
all right.
we weren't. But Maud Welch lived in a little cottage down there, and they took my brother in her house.
Okay.
And my mother and father were called to come there, and not me. I just went off the other way toward home, toward where we lived. And my brother died in that house, and so did my father.
Oh boy.
So my mother never talked about it. We never talked about it. So I never knew anything really at all about that. My brother's name was just as though he had disappeared.
Oh boy.
That was the old, it's kind of the old Yankee way of dealing with things.
Well, it's,
You simply, you don't talk about it. It's gone.
Yeah.
And
Oh boy.
his clothes disappeared, his toys disappeared, and
Yeah.
that was the way it was.
And he was only 7 or
6.
6.
Mhm.
He was really.
But we lived in a lot of houses. I lived in a lot of houses. And then of course the things when I'm talking about when I remember, we lived at the house at the head of the lane.
Right.
And so then my territory, went down to the Reynoldses and the Armsby ladies. And then there was an interesting old man whose name was Fernando Reynolds, and he lived in the last farm before you get into Petersburgh Village. Don't ask me the name of the people who live there now because I can't think of it.
Is it right up from the barber?
Mm-hmm.
On the same side. On the same side. Yeah. That's.
Yeah.
I don't know who lives there now either, but I know the house.
I know the name, but can't
It
think
would have
of
been on the other side of the railroad tracks from Barbara's.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that leaves out, of course, Jenny Brimmer, who lived in the little house that's recently been sold. A man who
Steve Kirk, who's
He's, well, what is it? He has a state position.
yeah, he was working for the HUD grants.
That's
and
right. And
he just bought that.
Yeah,
and
he
he's
bought
fixing
that,
it.
and he's done that. I guess I hear that he's done that in several places. He buys a place and fixes it, and then when he moves on, he has a nice house to sell. Yeah. A lady named Jenny Brimmer lived there, and she had been a school teacher. She taught in District 4, that was the village school, for a good many years, and she was not married. She lived alone and was not married. She had also had brothers and sisters who were, at least one, who had married and gone away. But see, there's another person, elderly person, unmarried, living alone.
Huh.
Then Fernand Reynolds, the same situation, an old man, not married, lived with his mother until she died, and she must have been very old because he was an old man with white hair and didn't live very many years after she did. But the mother had been a painter. And he called me into his house one day and gave me 2 little oil paintings. He put out a whole bunch of them. He said I could have 2, so I chose 2. And one of them I have now. It's a picture of a black kitten. And the other one, I don't know what happened to it. It was a little vase of violets, and my mother probably gave it to somebody while I was away at school. I don't know what happened with that. I wasn't as fond of it as I was the kitten anyway. And she also painted the picture of Henry's great-grandfather. No, there's one in our living room, and there's one in the greenhouse. So
okay.
Sooner or later, Victoria's boys will each have one, because Molly really hasn't any reason to want it. But she did pretty good portraits.
She was living then.
She was living when I first remember. But once again, you see, there was an old man, unmarried, living, well, after his mother died, living alone. Then in the next house, up on the hill.
Just to back up a second, you know what her name was? She was a
Mary
Reynolds.
Jane Reynolds.
Mary Jane
Mary
Reynolds.
Jane Reynolds.
And she was, okay.
Her background, I don't know.
Okay, that's just interesting.
With the town barber. And do you remember the old Andy Griffith show?
Yes.
Do you remember the barber
Yes.
on that? Well, Emmett was quite a lot like that. He would remind you a good deal. His name was Emmett Babcock, and his wife was Mary. And I used to go down there for some reason, on Sunday morning. And Mary would always offer me breakfast. They had breakfast late. And they had, at home, our pancakes were like, 3-4 inch pancakes. But when Mary made pancakes for Emmett, she made them the size of the plate. And that absolutely fascinated me. I don't remember eating pancakes. I think they offered me, but I had already had breakfast. But I loved to watch Mary make these huge plate-sized pancakes and stack them up on Emmett's plate, about 4 or 5 deep. And he would eat this huge plate of pancakes.
Where did they live?
Well, they were in the next house above Fernand's. That's the Brock boy, Harold Brock's son. I think he still lives there.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I know which house you mean. Yes.
That was Emmett's house.
And is that where he had his barbershop too? Or?
No, the barbershop was where, well, that's recently been sold. It was Earl Haynes' garage.
All right.
On the second floor.
That's where okay.
He was on the second floor, and for various things were on the floor below in that building. Lon Gorman had a store there for a while, a grocery store. But Emmett, for years and years, was upstairs. And he was a lot like Floyd the barber.
That's great.
Mary was an awfully good one. She lived to be into her 90s and was right up to the last days was changing her wallpaper every year, doing it herself.
Oh boy.
And she was one of the first women I ever saw who had her hair dyed, and Emmett dyed her hair jet black. Hair dye was either henna red or jet black then. And her hair remained black until Emmett died, and after Emmett died, she let her hair go natural.
And it became great.
Yes. Well, and across the road, when that house is gone now, when I first remember it, Elizabeth Gilcher's mother and father lived there, and Elizabeth and I are the same age, and we played together. She was really my first playmate. But they lived there only for maybe a year or so after we moved into the house in the village. But that's where my first social contact until a child my own age.
This is all before Route 22 or anything. I mean,
Route 22 had just been paved. Was paved, I believe, in 1920, 122, and that's when we came to the village.
But it was still head of lane, I mean.
Oh,
the
yes,
new
that was,
sections
oh, no,
of
the new
122
section
was,
wasn't there. No, that
Now,
was, that
when
was
you,
still the main road.
when you first moved there, the Worthington Inn had already burned, that was already gone. So was
Right.
that just a?
The
a
barn
real-
was there, but
the
not
barn.
the old building.
Was there anything there, or was it just a
No, it
ruined
was just
a
a
cellar hole?
cellar hole.
Because that's 22 runs right through the middle
Right
of that
through
now.
it, yeah, right, right.
Okay. When did the barn come down? Do you know that, or just?
Oh, that,
or
I
the
think,
horse
I
shed or
think that,
wagon shed, whatever it
it
was,
was, I think it'd been the livery. It was
Right.
quite a large building, and it was, I think it had
With
been
that
the livery that
overslut
went with the
hanging roof,
hotel, and yeah, it had kind of odd angles, as I
Yeah.
remember. That, I think, stayed there until the road changed.
Oh, boy.
Now, it may have been gone before that, but I don't
Yeah.
think so. I don't think so. I think it stayed there until the road changed. Then Judge Howard
When,
bought the.
just to interrupt,
Mm,
when
sure.
did the road change? When did they do that? Do you
Oh
know?
God, I'd hate
I
to.
know the other section was built after World War II, when they took out Armsby and then went above Armsby.
Well, that was all done the same time.
Okay, so it was right after,
Same
so
time.
in
It was-
the-
it
in the
was
la- in the
prob-
late 40s, I think.
Probably was. I was trying to think of it in connection with the Methodist Church, but it was done. I think it was done right after World War II. I think that must be right, because that's when they put that big retaining wall behind the
Right.
parsonage and all that. I think you're right about
Okay.
that.
So anyway, sorry to interrupt you. You were saying
No,
Judge
it's
Lewis.
okay. I'm likely to run on and off the subject. But Judge Howard bought the place next door to ours, where the Cars had lived, and he lived there for a while. And then he built the house on the hill behind it.
Okay,
The one that sort of sticks out like an area
It has
out over
that
the.
steep
Mhm,
driveway
mhm,
going
mhm.
up.
And he was a great friend of mine, a great friend of my father's, and a nice, an interesting man. He could tell lovely stories.
He was seems a character. It was a great picture we have. Of him
Yes,
with the pig,
yes,
you know?
yes. He was a character. He loved a good story. He loved a good story.
Because everybody who
And-
comes into the town hall now gets such a shock because they see that stern picture of him in the meeting room.
Yeah.
And they go around the hallway, and there's he sitting on the couch with the little piglet.
Well, I felt at one point that he saved my life. I don't. I wouldn't have been very serious, but that this was a few years later. My playmates at that time were the Hull twins, who lived up in Dr. Hull's house, of course, and I had a girl from Troy staying with me for the summer. She had a whole bunch of brothers and sisters, and my mother and father thought I needed company, I think, so they borrowed Maggie for the summer. So Maggie and I had been playing with Harriet and Eleanor, and we've been playing with lima beans that for some reason were left over from last year, and Mrs. Hull gave us to play with. We'd been playing with lima beans, so when we got ready to go home, we took some of these beans, and Harriet, who was kind of, she was more, she became a physician later. She was obviously real bright, but she was also had kind of a naughty streak. She said, you know what, you could scare people with those beans on the way home. So we each took a handful of beans, and I remember thinking, that would be a very nice thing to do. But Maggie was from the city, and she, instead of knowing about state troopers, she knew about the cops. And the cops were dangerous. They would get you, I guess her mother had said, if you do this, the cops will get you, Well, anyway, I don't remember which of us, whether one of us or both of us, when a car passed us on our way home, and we just sort of tossed the beans toward this car. And the car stopped, and out of it got 2 state troopers.
Oh, no.
Well, that was right by Gardner's house. That's where Mrs. Palmetier lives.
Right.
And there was a fence along there. Well, I sailed over that fence and went home. Of course, I knew the territory. Went home by the back way. But they got Maggie. And when I got home, I suppose I was crying. I don't remember that I was. Either that or mad. Probably mad. There on our back porch sat my father and Judge Howard. And I said, what's the matter with you? And I said, the cops have got Maggie, or the state troopers have got Maggie. I wouldn't have said cops. The state troopers have got Maggie. Well, of course, then the judge asked me why was all this, and my mother and I don't remember the conversation, except that the judge assured me that it was all right, that we weren't going to jail. And just about then, Maggie and the trooper came into the hand. And by then I'd explained that it was beans we threw, and they thought it was stones, you see. It wasn't stones we threw, it was just beans, and they wouldn't do any harm. Well, then the trooper was, I think he was feeling a little bit foolish. I remember he tried to give me a nickel, and I wouldn't take it. I wouldn't look at him, I was so disgusted.
Now, how old were you when this happened?
Well, I must have been maybe 8 or 9,
Okay.
8 or 9. I think it was, in all probability, it was the summer after my brother died. That was what would have been when I was 8, but I'm sure I wasn't more than 9.
Okay.
So that was my brush with the law. But I felt perfectly safe. The judge was there, and I knew that he'd protect me from the long arm of the law.
The other girl was from the city. What
She
city?
was from the city, Troy.
Oh, okay.
Troy, the city was Troy.
Exactly.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. She stayed with me a lot of summers. And one of the results of that was that her father worked for Gordon L. Hayes. That was a appliance, one of the early appliance stores. Isn't there anymore, but for years and years it was. And every time of course, in the 20s, new appliances were coming out regularly.
Oh.
And so we were able to get, my father was able to get like samples, you know, and we had a monitor top GE refrigerator, and that thing, if it's still on Earth, it's probably still going, and we had it and forever. I mean, finally my mother said she wanted a modern refrigerator, and when they left that house, they left a refrigerator in it. And that was 20 years later, and it was still going like perfectly. But Mom, I got a new refrigerator when she got a different house. And we had a electric coffee maker. Why, that was remarkable. Electric percolator. Of course, that didn't last very long because my mother forgot to put water in it one day. But and with electric toaster and radios. Wow. So that was a very productive, knowing somebody in the city gave us a lot, and in the appliance business, gave us a lot of interesting things.
Brings up just a question on radios. How many radio stations could you pick up in Petersburg at that time?
Well, the first set my father had, and that was when the cars still lived next door, so that must have been 1923 about. He had a little radio that had just one tube first, and you could get WGY and KDKA, Pittsburgh. I think those were just
Pittsburgh or Pittsfield?
Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh.
KDKA, still I think, KDKA in Pittsburgh.
Oh, it good travels that far. I mean, they used to have what they...
I guess there weren't a whole lot of other things to get in the way
yeah,
at that time.
True. That's true.
And later, somewhat later, we got WJZ, and that was New Jersey, Newark, I think.
Oh, boy.
And WBZ and WBZA in Boston. But by then, we had bigger radios. Then there was one with 2 tubes, and of course they all had headphones. And then there was one with then they came to a whole lot of tubes, when radios were like 3 or 4 feet long, with rows and rows of tubes. And a separate speaker.
Right.
Mostly the round speaker on the standard all by itself. And then by then there were, well, the object all this time was to see how many stations you could get and how far away you could get.
Okay.
And I can remember that my mother would always be wanting to listen to what was on the radio, and my father would always be wanting to find out how many more stations he could get.
That sounds pretty normal.
Yeah, I think.
Was there any, was it mostly, what kind of entertainment was on the radios? Was it,
Well, let's see, at first, I really don't remember. I can remember prize fights. Now let me think of what was the first one. They had Tunney. I think the first fight I remember was when Tunney beat Jack Dempsey. Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney. And I remember when Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic.
Sure.
That was 1926, I think.
Right. 27.
Was it 26 or 27?
27.
27.
Sure.
And I remember that coming over the radio. And of course, I don't believe you got things more than for a few hours a day.
Okay, so the radio wasn't broadcasting all the time.
No. It wasn't until in the 30s, there were all the soap operas, and by then radio was all, I guess, 24 hours a day practically.
Oh, right.
Most
so there was a big difference then between the 20s and 30s.
Between the 20s and the 30s in that.
Okay. How about broadcasting of music? Was that done very often, or was that...
Yeah, quite a lot, quite a lot. One thing they did was broadcast dance orchestras from local hotels. There was the hotel in Albany, the Kenmore. Hope I got the right city. I'm pretty sure the Hotel Kenmore was on Broadway, opposite Proctor's Theater, as I remember it. Anyway, the Hotel Kenmore, I think, and some dance orchestra played there. Like on Saturday night, they would broadcast all the dance music.
Right.
And if you didn't have a dance orchestra right there at hand, you could dance, you see, to the radio. And a little later than that, the soap operas started. But those were in the 30s.
Right.
You know, when we used to dash home from class, when I was in college, that was, because in high school we didn't get home in time, except for Vic and Sade, late in the afternoon.
Now, when you went to high school, where did you go to Hoosick Falls?
I went
or?
to Hoosick Falls.
Okay, and that had already started, so they'd already consolidated.
Oh, no, they weren't
Oh.
consolidated. No. Every district in Petersburg was a separate district when I went to school. And the first year I went, we paid our own own transportation. We rode in a car, an automobile, just a plain, ordinary sedan. There were 5 or 6 of us. It was big, and a man named Morgan from North Petersburg took us. And before that, Arthur Weaver had transported children. When Victoria went, Arthur Weaver had transported children to Hoosick Falls. The Hoosick Falls didn't charge any tuition, but it was, at that time, it was much larger and considered a much better school than Berlin. You could go to Berlin on the train pretty easily, and some people did, although not by any means everybody went to high school. You had to make an effort to go to high
Right.
school.
So education stopped basically at 8th grade.
8th grade, and a lot of boys got their working papers at 14, age 14.
Right, which.
And that would be, they would be just about getting through the 8th grade, if they were, they paid attention. Sometimes they passed the Regents, and sometimes they hadn't.
So, now, where was the Hoosick Falls High School then?
The Hoosick Falls High School, when I went to it, now that changed between the time Victoria went and the time I went.
Oh.
When, the time Victoria went, it was in what later became a grade school and is now gone, on Main Street in the village of Hoosick Falls.
Okay.
Next to where this, what is it, CHP or a bunch of doctors.
All right, yes.
Their place. It was right next to that. And there's, I think we go probably it's a parking lot now. That was known as the Main Street School, but it had been the high school. That became the Main Street School, and the Walter A. Wood Mansion, which stood at the top or behind the village park. The park is still there and has some where the Walter A. Wood house stood.
So near where the Grand Union is now. Is that
Right,
yes.
right. Oh, I think there's some kind of government subsidized housing in back of the park now. Well, that's that was high school. Walter A. Wood, through somehow, and I don't know how, whether he left the building to the school district, and now, of course, it would be considered a crazy thing to do, but it was really an awfully nice place to go to school. This elegant mansion,
sure.
Loaded with walnut burl paneling, and some of that paneling is now in Russell's house. In their living room, they have this gorgeous mirror, which it must be 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall. So it covers the whole side of the room, and all around it, it was originally walnut. Are carved flowers. There were dozens and dozens of them.
Yeah.
It's in the Gothic shape,
Right.
and it's all been painted white. But every time I kind of wish I could see those flowers without the paint on. But it wasn't a very practical thing to have in a 15 by 15 room, you see, and all that dark. But that came out of the Walter A. Wood house. But the classrooms, the bedroom floor was divided up into classrooms, and then they built another section of building on to the north side of that, where there were more classrooms and a gym and all the things.
Right.
But the main living rooms were the library, turned into the school library, and that was really lovely. A big drawing room and a big. I think it was another drawing room, although I believe the dining room had been across the corridor, and but the corridor was left intact with all this lovely paneling and the blinds, inside blinds, you know. Oh, it was really lovely.
When did that
That's all
cease to be,
gone.
when did that cease to be the high school?
Well, now once again, I can't tell you because it was long after I graduated, and it was after World War II when they built the high school out.
The current high school.
on
And then when did the
flats.
Walter Woods place, that burned, didn't it, or?
No,
oh, it was-
no, they just took it down.
They
I
took
don't
it
know whatever
down?
happened, yeah.
Oh.
All kinds of things. People tried to save it. After they gave it up as a school, they wanted to make a museum of it, and, but then, of course, there was all of this additional high school stuff that was useless.
Right.
And as a mansion, it wasn't good anymore because the rooms had been all made over into schoolrooms.
Right, so,
And so there was just nothing to do with it except, I guess, tear it down. And I hope some of the fine woodworking was saved and
Exactly.
put some other place. But I don't know whether that happened or not.
so most of the children from, from Petersburg would have gone up to Hoosick Falls?
From
on,
about, I think probably Victoria's, well, once in a while there were, for years and years, there were people who went there. My grandfather wanted my mother to go, but he had 5 boys and my mother was the only girl. My mother badly wanted to go on to school, but they were poor, I guess you'd have to say, average poor. And with these 5 boys, pay to send a girl's board for a girl to go to high school was just not something he felt he could do. And but he said he would. But Mama wouldn't go unless her brother Ralph could go, because Uncle Ralph was also very anxious for an education. And, my grandpa said one of you can go, but neither one would go without the other.
Oh, boy.
So Mama taught herself to type and then got a job with the Success Company. And Uncle Ralph, although he never got any more education, he did all right too. But at the same time, there was a boy whose name was Nugent, and he lived in Lope and Lewis Hollow, and he walked to Hoosick Falls to high school.
Wow.
Now, I suspect, because I have cousins in Hoosick Falls, that he walked, he told it, I used to be friendly with him. He told it as though I thought the time he walked every day, but I don't think he did. I think he'd walk up on Monday morning and stay